Here comes the honey, here comes the coffee. This ought to do it. Okay. Yeah, I mean, there's so many things to talk about. I mean, Oliver and I have already been together 3 times with audiences, and tonight we'll be showing Wall Street at 7:15 at Town Hall Theater. I mean, I think that for me, I mean, there are a number of different ways to approach Oliver and his work, and so maybe we'll try a couple of different approaches. But one of them is that in American commercial film, in the film industry itself, what we could refer to as the political film was sort of non-existent. I mean, you could say On the Waterfront was a political film, and I think it was. Sort of from a more conservative point of view. It was basically anti-union, for one. You could say The Grapes of Wrath was a political film, drawing attention to poor dirt farmers in Oklahoma and the challenges and moving west and just the struggle of all of that.
So was Birth of a Nation.
So was Birth of a Nation, of course, and hugely so at a difficult time, and helped to revive the Ku Klux Klan. And in fact, we were just talking earlier today, because we give a Thaddeus Stevens Award for the great abolitionist who was born and raised in Vermont.
Oh, really?
Yeah, yeah.
He was played by Tommy Lee Jones.
Tommy Lee Jones played him in Lincoln. Where he grew up was actually 2 houses away from my place over in the Northeast Kingdom.
That was a wonderful characterization.
Yeah.
At the end, they cut to him with the black wife.
That's right.
It was great.
That's right. Although in Birth of a Nation, he is caricatured as the problem. Thaddeus Stevens is.
Huh. I got to see that again.
Yeah.
There's so many other political films you've missed. I mean,
I'm not finished yet, but keep going. What do you got?
I mean,
Well, if we get to foreign films, we get to films like Z.
No, but in America,
Battle of Algiers.
Didn't we have All the President's Men? Didn't we have All the King's Men back in 1948?
Yeah.
All kinds of films.
I
wouldn't go that far. I think you're barking up the wrong tree there.
Well, I'm going to keep barking. In terms of films that inspired you, I mean, were it these American films? Was it Z? Was it Battle of Algiers?
No, I'm on record for saying Z because I was at film school. It was my 1969-70 at NYU, and guess who shows up? Costa Gavras and Yves Montand. And they're very magnetic. The cast was great. As film students, we just responded to the film like over-enthusiastic. We're all ready for making those kind of movies, but the only ones in America that were being made were Emile d'Antonio,
right?
And
sure.
That
The Year of the Pig.
film, and some of them that you know. Jay's involved much more in the movement of that time than I was. I was rather innocent, but Battle of Chile you mentioned, and you mentioned documentaries.
Well, Battle of Algiers, yeah.
But you couldn't make that in Hollywood terms.
Yeah.
Because once we got into the Cold War, you could not possibly represent the other side as sympathetic in any way. That's what I think.
Sure. Well, that's where we're getting to the same tree that we're barking up. So what I'm trying to say is that, yes, I mean, part also that is true of these earlier American political films, and even the later ones like All the President's Men, right? Was that what it's called?
Yes.
Yeah. Were that they were deeply steeped in a sort of American cultural milieu. They were star-driven, and the messages certainly were, in some cases, metaphorical, in some cases, true to life. But I think that what happened, Platoon was a film that, yes, did challenge Cold War sensibilities, which had not been done directly in an American film about the war in Vietnam. It had a visceral impact. It was action-driven. It made the audience feel uncomfortable, and part of what I'm leading to is that I don't think that the films we've just talked about, maybe Birth of a Nation did, but that All the President's Men did not really approach the audience in a way that was going to make it feel uncomfortable. But Platoon does. And so does Salvador, certainly, I think. And the idea of the film having such success, I mean, it was an independently financed film. Hollywood was not going to make this film. But nonetheless, made on a budget for $6 million, grossed $140 million, was the third biggest box office film of the year, and sort of, when you do that, Hollywood has to listen to you. And so I'm curious, just some thoughts around that. I mean, did you consciously know, making Platoon, this is a film that is going to do something that films haven't done before in the American tradition?
No, really, no. I mean, that's all. This is hindsight, 30, 40 years later, and I appreciate what you're saying, because it was really, Platoon had been turned down for 10 straight years. I mean, it was a script I got very known for in the Hollywood circles, and they admired me as my talent, but no one wanted to make this movie. So it was rather frustrating. The only reason I got any success was eventually I was hired to do Midnight Express, which was a movie that went through the roof, also did very well, and then that launched my career. And then I was able to come back eventually after Scarface to make, well, I also wrote Born on the 4th of July in 1979, and that also was regarded highly and almost made by Al Pacino in the role. But again, the will to make those movies is such a fight to get those things made. I can't tell you, it's the odds are against. The only reason Platoon got made in 1986 was that people were very, Vietnam turned around, and that's really the reason. The films, Apocalypse Now, Deer Hunter, Coming Home, had all softened the turf, although they were not, certainly the first two films were not realistic in any way. But Coming Home was, but that didn't do any business. But anyway, it was the Rambo films and the Chuck Norris films, and you remember what those were about. That Sylvester goes back to Vietnam to recover our missing in action, which becomes a sacred cause, which it was in the American media. They loved the POW thing, and they went on, and if you were a Vietnam veteran, you constantly heard it. But I thought it was a diversion from the truth, which was, yeah, let's go back. There are some people over there that got left behind. So that's the way of war. I mean, come on. So many people disappear, so many people are left behind. It's just the nature of chaos and combat. So here we are fighting over this old issue in order for Sylvester to go back to Vietnam and wipe out more Vietnamese. Same thing was true about Chuck Norris, who was, as you know, he's a deadhead or whatever, but he's a very important figure, and Missing in Action made a lot of money. So those kind of movies broke the ice in the sense that, hey, you know, maybe we should take one little shot on a combat picture that won't cost too much, because Rambo was costing a lot of money by the time after the first film. Boy,
but also Where We Triumph, which was not, yeah. So there was a counter narrative being developed in the Vietnam films that were being made.
But there was no American company that made it. You've said that before. It was made by, reluctantly, in spite of, by a British company, which a lot of balls, a British company, Hemdale Pictures. They made Salvador and they made Platoon back to back. And that was only because of the vision of the one man, John Daly, who was the producer, owner of the company, and he gave me the trust necessary to send out units to Mexico and then to Philippines to get this thing made. So we're very lucky, and it was a slice in time, and I have no illusions about it, but it really shook up the whole thing. But the studios went back to their old ways, you know. It's not, you have to understand, there was a struggle to make Born on the 4th of July 3 years later about a paraplegic. Even if with Tom Cruise was a hot young actor, but considering that he was castrated halfway through the movie, it was a turnoff to the studios because his big audience was young people, especially women, girls. So those girls are not going to go see a movie like that. Anyway, that was a kind of prejudice. And we did well with Bourne in spite of, we made it a very tight budget. Those of you who have seen the film know how hard a film it is. It was really unrelenting because it was Ron Kovic's story. Then when I turned to the Vietnamese side of the equation, and I made Heaven and Earth, which was the third film in a so-called trilogy, and it was a story of a Vietnamese girl, a peasant girl, from the villages, not from the city, who went through extraordinary story of on both sides, and came to America, went back to, it's a hell of a story. Heaven and Earth, I'm very proud of it. It's one of my best movies, I think, but still, it just didn't do any business here in 1993 when it came out. None at all. The same year, actually, I produced, or the year after, I produced Joy Luck Club, which was about Oriental people, Asian people, but it was, because it was a domestic story about mothers and daughters, I think it was much more successful. And people paid attention for the first time, and it's noted as one of the first new Asian films. But now, really speaking, there's very few. There's a new Asian thing going on, but I'm not sure how deep it is.
In making Platoon, what did you want to do that had not been done? Why make this film?
Well, because there was so much illiterate stuff out there, including Rambo, about combat, about the way things are done. Even Apocalypse Now, I mean, it's very romantic and glamorous and big, as was Deer Hunter, Deer Hunter is fabulous. It's suspenseful, but it's a distortion, and nothing like that even happened. So I just wanted to do a regular thing that happened to people like me, who went into regular combat units and were not special forces, or we were draftees, most of us.
Did you think about the fact that the film would make people uncomfortable, and was that desirable?
No, I didn't care. I was, what the hell? I mean, I'd been there, and they needed.
They just wanted.
The problem in Vietnam is we keep hiding everything. America hides everything they can. They don't trust the people. They just don't even want to see. The whole concept in Platoon, I don't know if you've seen it, but if one of the main themes of the movie is that one sergeant does off the other because he's being charged with war crimes. So he goes after the sergeant and he gets him under the guise of combat. That happened in terms of our own men being killed by our own ammunition, by our own men, was common. It was much more common than the Pentagon wants to admit, and they covered that up completely. This is called, they were identified only as KIA, but if you ever traced it and found out how the man died, you'd find that I'd say 15 to 20% of those cases, they died from our own artillery, from our own combat fire in asymmetrical situations where you don't know where you're shooting, or you don't even pay attention. You throw things out there and you don't even know. Artillery, howitzers coming in, airplanes, bombs. It was very dangerous in those war zones, and there was a lot of that going on. A lot of it.
I'm wondering.
And it was never noted. And
yeah,
it's part of
sometimes friendly fire it was called, or sometimes
it's as bad as the cover-up as what they were saying, that we were winning the war for so long up until 1968.
So you went to Vietnam as a volunteer. You wanted to be in the infantry. You didn't want a position behind a desk in the press office in Saigon. You wanted to be on the front lines.
Yeah.
So what happened to you when you were there? What changes did you go through? How did you experience it? What did you expect, and what happened in place of that?
I changed my mind very quickly. If you saw Platoon, you saw the Charlie Sheen's attitude when he actually goes through the process of walking point, walking flank, digging foxholes. It's a miserable life.
Yeah.
And if you're a new guy, you really had much more put on top of you, because they didn't give a damn about you. Mm-hmm. They really didn't. I mean, honestly, it was. Also, the Army was very poorly structured because we were replacement troops. We would go in to replace troops because there was a constant turnover. It's like a modern day sports team, constant turnover. So you don't have any sense of identification or unification to the units.
And you arrive on day one and you're in action automatically. And in your case, you got injured pretty quickly, right?
Well, not first day. They do give you a few days training in country, and then you go out there. But it's the heat and the combination of factors, and also having to cut point on day one, stuff like that. Yeah, I was wounded pretty quickly. Back a few days later.
So how did you experience this? What happened in your thinking? I mean, did it simply become a strategy for survival? Was the connection to the other soldiers crucial to?
Well, that's a very good question, because you have to deal with the concept of morale. And when you're facing 360 days or 45 days, and there are other people in your unit who are saying 22 days and I'm out of here, and Deros, they're timing their days. So it was very poorly done. Also, the officers kept revolving. We didn't pay much attention to the officers. They didn't mean anything to us. Our bosses were sergeants and line sergeants, and those guys, you had to stay well with them. You have to stay in a good relationship with some kind of sergeant in that group, and you did. It was better for you.
Did you think about what you would do when you got out of the service? Did you think about where you wanted to go?
We talk about it all the time, like we were going to be millionaires. We'd go down, we'd open construction companies, we'd go back to the States and do this and do that. None of that happened.
Yeah, right. So you got back to the States, and how long was it before you enrolled at NYU's film school?
About 8 months or something. No, it was just... my story is like my drugs and confusion and numbness. But the story for people like Ron Kovic was, of course, much more difficult. But I have to say, the black troops, which were a significant portion of our, maybe 30%, certainly more.
And they're played very well in Platoon. Great actors, Keith David, Forrest Whitaker.
Their choices going home were very limited unless they joined official organizations like the post office, the police corps, firefighters, or something like that. It was just, there were no jobs, and they were going back to small cities. Mm-hmm. So I don't know how many came from Vermont. Wasn't a big one, but certainly the South would have been a big place for recruitment. So all those little towns in Tennessee, Kentucky, they were there.
So were there any soldiers in your platoon that had your background of Ivy League college and prep school?
No, but I didn't talk about that at all. Give me a break. Why would I do that?
Well, I'm not suggesting you did. I'm just wondering.
My job. I wanted to do it. I wanted to shut up. I didn't want to be special. I didn't want to volunteer for anything. And certainly in the Army, you don't want to volunteer for anything. And get through. I wanted to be like every man, like going on a ship 2 years before the mast. Remember that story?
Yeah.
That was Charles Dana. Yeah, I wanted to be an artist. I was sick and tired of the elite Yale University experience. Mm-hmm. And in my class was George Bush, of all people. George W. Bush, as well as all his financiers. Several of those people were around. Roland Betts and Steve Schwartzman. There was quite a class. In the class was also 2 years ahead of Strode Talbot, the propagandist, and John Kerry was in the class 3 years before, and he became he was supposed to be president of the United States,
He had a chance.
He screwed it up.
When you made JFK, it would seem that studio money would also be difficult to get. But in fact, you were able to get studio money. Maybe we could hear a little bit about that.
That was a case where I was really riding high, and that's very rare, because I had just done Born on the 4th of July, and then I'd been accorded a second Oscar as a director. So I was in a position, frankly, where I was one of the hottest, if not the hottest director on the street, and I was given relative carte blanche, and I wanted to do The Doors, which I did first. Did it as big, in the big way that I wanted to do it, and then I went right into JFK, which I had talked to the Warner's execs about, and I sold it to them as a murder story, as a mystery, as a thriller. Here's a guy who gets killed. We find out that everything is wrong about about what's reported at the time, and that there's something going on that's much bigger. And of course, there's this little guy in New Orleans, and this is a true story, you know, Jim Garrison, who's saying this, and no one's believing him. They're completely running them down. So to me, it was a little man, Goliath, David and Goliath story, and I loved it. And they said, go for it. They didn't really see all the implications of what would happen. Of course, the more we got into it, the more research we did, and more people came forward to tell us stuff. It became more and more poison. Became more and more incisive and accusatory. And frankly, when you know the facts of the case, and very few people really do, you really follow this. It's such a blatant misdirection given by the Warren Commission that it's worthy of the movie, and it grew in size, like a mushroom, into something that it was probably the Warner's executives did not plan on. Remember, they had just done Pakula's All the President's Men.
Right. Well, you mean All the President's Men, also Parallax View.
And Parallax View. They were thinking that.
Yeah.
And I think it just got bigger and bigger. My model on that was Z. Again, Z was about a murder in Greece, based on a true story, and that murder is revealed to the audience to be a sham.
Right.
The way it's officially represented, and you go the whole story. It's fascinating. Well done.
It's set in Greece, which was another country with political instability and assassination.
67.
But it's also, I have heard that Costa Gavras expressed, an interest in the Kennedy assassination, and saw it. Certainly, when I saw it, I mean, it was the one time we saw articulated what we felt we'd experienced. That Costa Gavras had Kennedy at least in the back of his mind, if not,
Really?
Yeah, when he made that film, and that assassination was becoming a theme when you start thinking about, Guatemala, and you start thinking about GM and Vietnam.
People forget that right after JFK came out and made it enormous, it made more money than anybody ever dreamed. It was not expected, you see. But a year later, Clint Eastwood, who I admire, but still, Clint is conservative. He made In the Line of Duty, which is about a guy who's
on the Secret Service detail.
So they brought back into the Oswald bullshit one more time, and they keep doing that. They keep saying Oswald did it, but he never had a trial, so they always should say the alleged murderer if they want to stick to that scenario.
Of course, the United States House of Representatives investigated the Kennedy assassination for several years and concluded that Oswald did not act alone. Do you feel that affected consciousness? Did it affect the reception of the film?
To some degree. Sure. I mean, the people who know. People who do the work know. But it's way beyond that now. I mean, we found so much more declassifications going on because of our film. Our film created a stir. Congress passed the law, JFK Act, Records Act. The reason they passed it was because they wanted to destroy our film. They wanted to prove that our film was full of BS.
It made people feel uncomfortable.
But the contrary happened, because the moment they start opening more files, I never thought anything would be in them anyway, but little bits of this community of researchers, and they did the work of researching it. I didn't do that. I used their work. That community is very smart and very extensive, and they communicate with each other. And the moment they release these little bits and pieces, it's very funny, but these researchers devoured it line by line, and they came up, among other things, with the Operation Northwoods, which nobody even knew about. Operation Northwoods is a big deal because back in '62, the Pentagon had a plan to bomb civilian sites in the United States. It's sort of a 9/11 plan, in order to blame the Cubans and go into Cuba. So that was on the boards, including blowing up an airliner. That was in the plan. So those kind of things, little bits and pieces in a declassification. And this went on and on and on until, and we were very much hoping to get another piece of evidence, because so many people in the CIA, about 6 of them, are involved with Oswald. We know this from, it's beyond a doubt. He was talking to these people for years, but he especially concentrated in that period before '63. He was involved in this ring, and James Angleton, David Phillips, William Harvey, the figure keeps pointing back to them, as well as Allen Dulles, who was fired by Kennedy. Dulles went on to, never lost his power. Dulles lived in Georgetown and was meeting with those CIA people all the way up through the assassination.
Okay, let's shift gears a little bit. When you go to make a film, what interests you the most during production? I know you like to write, so we're going to...
Oh, the fun about making a film is it's so difficult, and putting the pieces together, I think it's solving them. Certainly you have very talented people working with you, and it's like, oh man, there's so many, it's like finding a war and being a general, which I get a kick out of. You know, it's a military situation. The writing is very much a crucial part of it, a crucial part, and if your writing is not working, it's going to put a big hole in your plans. It's the basis. On the other hand, you have actors, you have crew, you have many setups, you have many challenges, including editing and including the release of the film, which plays a huge role in the film. So many good films go down without being seen. The release is not a good one. So you have to think about all these things. It's quite a job, and it takes a lot out of you.
How did you develop writing skills and sensibilities?
Alone.
Is it because you had success very early with the Academy Award for Midnight Express?
Yeah.
So that must have been reassuring at some level. You always start from scratch.
Yeah, sure. It was.
So, I mean, is it people you read? Is it teachers you had in boarding school? Was it just writing and learning from your own writing?
My father used to make me write a theme every week for 25 cents. He'd give me 25 cents to write any story I wanted. And so I'd rip off all the TV shows and do, all my silly writing, but actually that habit, because I wanted the money. I wanted that 25 cents so I could buy a comic. I love classic comics. If you had to be 1950s classic comics, all the great stories were in there. Tale of Two Cities, Treasure Island, all the classics, Count of Monte Cristo. They were in comic form. So I wanted to. That's where the movies are. You kind of imagination. So having fun, getting away from school, getting away from all the stuff you go through, and hanging out in your own imagination is a wonderful act of rebellion.
Developing instincts that you can start to trust and act, and characters can start to speak to you.
Yeah.
In Platoon, you have the two characters, the light and the dark. You have Willem Dafoe playing Elias. You have Tom Berenger playing Barnes. How did that dramatic development occur to you? How far into the writing were you, or did you imagine it right off?
Yeah, I hate to say one is good versus evil. I mean, that's a little simplistic. Yeah. But the truth was, the model was the Iliad. The Iliad is a very powerful story, and the idea was the boy was going to be a bit like the Odysseus character. He would see all this stuff, and Achilles was Elias because of his agility and his noble feelings. Although Achilles is, of course, also has ignoble ones, but the Hector, the others, well, the Greeks, the Trojans. Who is the bad guy? There is no bad guy. You can say there was just the opposition of Hector and Achilles gave me the idea.
Okay.
Or you could say Agamemnon and Achilles, but somewhere it was in there. And I wanted to, because it seemed to me the Trojan War fits the Vietnam War. It was going on for so long. It was in the 11th year they sacked the city, but the Odyssey's about, Alien's about 9 years. Vietnam, in terms of the American experience, in terms of combat, was about 1965 through 73. It's almost 9 years.
Now you like Joseph Conrad. How about Hemingway?
Oh yeah,
These guys that
all that
influenced you?
stuff. Yeah, they're great. And they're
T.S. Eliot.
Well, that's school stuff.
Yeah, right.
Listen, I'm not particularly educated, but I read a lot and I enjoy it.
Yeah. So, how do you approach working with actors? How do you get them where they need to be? How do you interact with them? To what extent do you really see actors as being key to the whole process?
Oh, very, very important. Some actors are so intelligent and intuitive. They bring stuff to the role. They give you things that you never even thought about. They extend the script, and they deepen it and humanize it. So it's an organic relationship. It's very close, and it's awful when you don't have the right actor. Put it that way.
Yeah, right. Some people say that directing is what you do to make up for your mistakes in casting.
Well, I had one film I remember with a lead, but I'm not going to tell you who, but he wouldn't take any direction, and it was very frustrating to work with him because he knew what he wanted to do. And fine, okay, that's the way you want to play it. I'm not going to stand in your way, but as a result, he played the role in a certain way, and I got it, and it works in its way.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Is there a way that you communicate with actors in particular, or
No, I try. I try every which way because they're all different. Every one of them. Sometimes you have to be very direct and saying, "Listen, we have a problem." Sometimes you have to be. I'm not into the. I hate the directors who always say. There are directors who always say, "That was great. That was great. That was great." They keep saying it. That they're lying through their teeth. But they inflate the lie, and I hate that because it's untrue. If there is a problem, you should get to it, and I'd rather do that because then the actor really pays attention to what you're saying, as opposed to, oh yeah, this guy's a jerk, he's stupid. He's going to say it's great no matter what I do.
Yeah. I mean, different casting would change a film. I mean, Kevin Costner is important to JFK. Tom Cruise is crucial to Born on the 4th of July.
But like baseball stars and sports, I mean, they cost a fortune so much that it's getting to be like, it's just not a game anymore.
Do you find yourself playing a producing role, generally speaking?
Yeah, it's inevitably, informally, yes.
But you want producers who are responsible for...
I'd rather have a strong producer, yes,
Yeah.
who's helping me as opposed to trying to do it alone.
What American filmmakers do you admire?
Oh, come on, there's so many. I like movies, you can't do that to me. It's like hundreds of movies. You go down the list, tell me who I don't like.
All right. We'll go down the list. John Ford.
Of course. Of course.
Chaplin.
Yeah. I mean, everybody you're going to say, they all did some great work, and that's, let's be honest. They also made some shitty, at least Ford made some shitty films.
Yeah. Well, I mean, there was a period in the late 40s, early 50s where styles of acting and performance really changed, and under the influence of Lee Strasberg and Tennessee Williams and Ilya Kazan, people like that.
Yeah, they say that. But I'm not so sure. I feel like you go back to the 30s, some of these 30s films, you look at Paul Muni and his work, and so many people were so realistic. They were stars. They were stars because they could take realism and put it into these characters. So, I feel it's a lot of media hype. 50s and Marlon Brando and all that. Yeah, it's partly true, but it's not like Waterfront is the beginning of a new era completely. It's like it's always going on. There's changes.
Yeah, I mean, Henry Fonda in Grapes of Wrath is a pretty realistic performance. We can take a question or two if people have something in the audience that they'd like to ask. Yeah.
Talk a little bit about like how do you know something's ready to be made into a movie? I mean, obviously there's like the financial factor and stuff, but like how do you know like a historical episode is like ripe enough to make a movie about it?
How do you know if an historical episode is ripe enough to make a movie about it?
I think if it has a beginning and beginning, middle, and end, you know, to some degree, I mean, you need that. You can't tell the Donald Trump story without kind of knowing where it's going, right? So that seems obvious to me, but having a shape, an outline, a character, finding your theme, just chasing the news doesn't interest me because the news is extremely complex. And it's very superficial, as is most of our news, because it takes time to understand.
In making JFK, did you feel that you were beholden in any way to the research that had proven itself, it had been viable to establishing a theory, or did you trust your own imagination to go in places where it seemed right?
Well, if you remember, it's in Jim Garrison's book, his theory, and he's very clear and articulate about it. And it does, and frankly, it makes sense. Now, Jim did not have all the pieces of the puzzle, because it was impossible to prove anything about the covert community, which was unknown, basically, to the American people at that time. Impossible to discuss covert activity in an overt trial. So he was very hampered, but all the research community, for the most part, I think I followed the main line, which was, it points to, you need official power to pull this off. Those people, they say, a bunch of the mob and this and that, it still doesn't cover all the facts of the autopsy and the cover-up too.
You've made 6 films, I think, that deal with the 60s, the 1960s. How are you feeling today about the 60s? I mean, of course, the JFK assassination is arguably the crime of the century, still unsolved. There was an activism, there was an idealism, there was an engagement, there was a certain degree of, joy and free love and sex, drugs, and rock and roll. I mean, how do the 60s resonate to you today?
Oh, Jay, you're going to depress me again. I think we discussed this. It's just we're in a very precipitous time. Obviously, the lessons of war have not sunk in. I mean, I think most American people don't want war, but they end up being suckered into it. And there have been so many Vietnams now, and it's just so fucking ridiculous. So much money has been wasted. That's all I can say right now.
I mean, there also was, certainly feminism came alive in the 60s in a way that hadn't been before. There was civil rights advances that took place in the 60s that continue to resonate, although they're challenged. Activism came alive in the 60s that I think that became a model for how, people respond, feeling that they can have a say. So, yeah, I don't think it's totally depressing, but I think that there are also dark elements. And I was interested in looking at sort of the filmography for the year of the release of Platoon and other films that came out that year. I mean, you were sort of second or third generation of the new cinema. I mean, there was the 70s movies of Chinatown and Bonnie and Clyde, which also apparently had some connection to Vietnam in terms of Arthur Penn's desire to depict violence as more visceral and more real. You had The Godfather, you had these films, Taxi Driver, into late 80s, you're looking at Top Gun, you're looking at also Blue Velvet. David Lynch was just coming into scene at that point, who again was darker, but also sort of metaphysical in some ways, an interesting director. Platoon was the most sort of startling, in-your-face type of movie, but
We'll do the right thing.
Do the Right Thing, yeah, came out just a year or two after She's Gotta Have It came out actually in '86, and then Do the Right Thing came out like '87, '88, which was similarly '89. Spike Lee was sort of in some ways parallel to your development. So a more politically engaged black filmmaker, a more politically engaged white filmmaker taking on that same time period. But the 60s, I mean, so the 60s were artistically also a very dynamic time. If you think of music, I mean, you made The Doors, okay? A lot was in play, and I would argue that plenty of it continued forward, although there was also a force to restrain what came out of the 60s.
Well, Jay is an expert on the 60s. He lived in the 60s. I think that was your most dominant era, wouldn't you say?
Yeah, but how about you?
No, I was more passive about that. I was more an observer. I was not an activist. So I really, I took my share of drugs in the 60s, you know, and I had fun too.
Okay.
I wasn't, you know, on the front lines and going to Washington and protesting the Vietnam War because I thought I was really divided.
You were certainly on the front lines of the 60s.
Later.
Yeah, but also, I mean, being in Vietnam is being on the front lines. I mean, you experienced stuff about Vietnam that I did not experience.
Yeah, but I was a nobody. I was just a PFC.
Yeah,
You know.
well, there you go. The common man, Henry Wallace. Another question. Yes, right here.
Yeah, I'd like to ask about post-production. Have you ever gotten into a moment where you realize that you've missed something, like a piece of coverage or an insert, and you don't have time to go back? How do you find the scene? How do you salvage it knowing that you're missing something and still get it?
Have you ever missed anything in post-production where you discover there's something missing that you really need? What do you do? Do you go back? Do you...
Yeah, you go back. Yeah, it's a hard admission to make, but sometimes you do have to go back. For example, Born on 4th of July, Tom Cruise did not like the way we shot the ending, the last scene, and he's a very strong sense of what the audience wants, and he's good at that. So he suggested that we do it again, and he actually lobbied Universal to get us the money to do that scene again, which was the Democratic National Convention. There you go. So I went back and did that, but very rarely have I done that.
That's a big scene to have to go back and do, Democratic National Convention.
Yeah, but it was done, and they gave us enough money to make it downtown LA.
Yeah, okay. Another question, yes.
Can I ask a non-movie question?
A non-what?
Non-movie.
A non-movie question.
Yes, I wanted to know your opinion of
I want to know your opinion of Putin. This is the question I was hoping to avoid, but...
Well, it's not about Putin, it's about Russia. And the United States right now, I mean, the DNC won't admit it, but this President Biden has basically started this invasion of Russia. I mean, this is really an attack across red lines at the heart of the Russian interests. And we, as a country, never voted on it. Never voted on it. And we don't know anything about Russia, it seems to me. And the making of that movie was to introduce us to some of this stuff. And many people liked that series. It's a 4-part series. And it was seen quite a lot. However, a very, frankly, know-nothing element has attacked that movie since the beginning and attacked me as a communist and all that stuff. You know, I'm sick of it. It's just, I'm doing it for money and this. I mean, it's so crazy, the attacks. You know what they're like. They slime.
Yeah, we watched an episode of Oliver's Untold History of the United States last night, focused on FDR, Henry Wallace, and Harry Truman. that really makes a pretty strong case for the fact that we could have avoided developing the Cold War, first of all, and we could have avoided dropping the nuclear bomb. There's another episode later where Oliver deals with Gorbachev and Reagan and their relationship and what happened during that presidency, and how Gorbachev, who was the most progressive person who had come alive in Russia ever, although Khrushchev, was part of also the denunciation of Stalin. I mean, this is an extremely complex history. One of the elements that became apparent in this movie is that Gorbachev had placed on the table with Reagan the total disarmament of nuclear weapons. This would have been huge. And I feel it especially now because I think we're in a situation where the nuclear threat is actually greater than it has been in a long time. And pushed very hard. And even in leaving the negotiations in Reykjavik before Reagan got into his car, because it came very close, Reagan came very close to agreeing to this, but got involved with wanting to defend Star Wars and his personal, desire to see Star Wars develop. And just before Reagan gets into the car, Gorbachev goes to him and says one last time, "We can still walk back inside. We can still get this done." And his aides put him in the car and go. So, what a missed opportunity. And I think that the untold history of the United States is very important because it shows inflection points in American history where alternatives existed, two paths existed, and one path was taken and the other was missed. And I think that, we could talk for a long time about Russia and Ukraine and the whole thing. I mean, I'm somebody who opposed Putin's moving into Ukraine. But I also know that Gorbachev, for dismantling the Soviet Union, was promised by the United States explicitly that there would not be encroachment in Eastern Europe, which is an area through which Russia has been invaded repeatedly, and in the case of the Second World War, lost 30 million people fighting Hitler. Nonetheless, that promise was reneged upon, and so we're dealing with a chaotic situation in that region. And Oliver's interviews with Putin, I think, are instructive. I encourage you to go see them. They were done before the Ukraine war. Oliver also has, this guy likes to get in trouble. He is the fearless outsider. He has also interviewed Fidel Castro, Hugo Chavez. His most recent documentary is about Lula da Silva, the president of Brazil, who went from the presidency into prison and came back out and is now the head of Brazil again. And in watching the Fidel Castro interviews, because I'm also a student of history, I thought he asked all the right questions. And this came up last night in our discussion. It's important that we be asking these questions. It's important that these 4 episodes exist of talking to Putin, because we accomplish nothing by not knowing or not wanting to know. And as I said before, one of Oliver's stock in trade is making people somewhat uncomfortable with what he does. But there is a tonic effect. There is a cleansing effect that takes place by going and facing some of this, straight on. I'm just adding that. Not answering for
Considering
Oliver.
that this is a strange era, we don't even have any diplomatic relationship with Russia. I don't even know that we have a phone call going on.
Yeah, for me, the Ukraine war has now gone on for close to 3 years. A lot of people are suffering. Military equipment is being wholesale pumped into this region. Where are the diplomats? Where are the diplomats? Some of Oliver's film on Wallace, FDR, and Truman shows FDR on the front line of diplomacy, going into negotiating sessions himself in poor health, not knowing what's going to come out of that session, and putting all the cards on the table and having to deal with Churchill, who was not always easy to deal with, and Stalin at the same time, but needing to come out with success. Where are the diplomats? That's my question.
You said something interesting last night. You said in every kind of meeting between leaders, G7, it's all scripted in advance. We know what's going to happen. So
yeah, that's right.
In those days, that's what meetings were about, to come to us a new kind of resolution. That's gone. It's all preempted by television. When when Trump went to Helsinki, that was disgusting. The American media just fucking killed him and said, "There's no hope. You're going to talk to this monster." And what kind of? I mean, you imagine that happening in Roosevelt's day. If you're going to talk to Stalin, you can't do that. It's against the rules. There are no rules in this world. Rules have to be negotiated.
Yeah.
Who saw Chapter 2 last night? I'm just curious. Anybody here? I think you have some idea of the scope of this, how different Truman was from Wallace, and what a difference it made.
Yeah, this is a case where Henry Wallace, who was Roosevelt's vice president, was in line to succeed Roosevelt, but there was a move from conservative elements in the Democratic Party to stop Wallace, despite his overwhelming popularity. And the guy who was going to place Wallace's name in nomination was 9 seconds from being able to do it when the power brokers adjourned the session of the Democratic National Convention, and overnight politicked and made deals. And I mean, it just, the stuff is interesting. And as I also said last night on any of this, and somebody said to me once, well, Oliver Stone's version of Nixon, I mean, I just don't, I don't buy it. I said, he's got a version, okay? We should have as many versions as we possibly can. But Oliver's version is totally, worth considering and getting a conversation started that leads us into better understandings of what happens. And without this information, without the interviews with Fidel Castro and Putin and others, we don't know. We accept the surface of what there is to go, and it's complicated. Yes, woman right back there. Yes.
I was just wondering, it's more of an artistic question, but with films like The Doors and Natural Born Killers, are there any visual artists that perform your work, like painters or people that you admire?
For The Doors and Natural Born Killers, films that you've done, are there any visual artists whose work you're drawn to, or who inspire you, in terms of the look of those films or others?
I can't say that any one person dominates my thinking. It was steal from everybody. Feel free. That's what I try to do, and I don't have any compunctions about that. In editing, it's what works.
Yeah, I sort of compare Oliver's work also somewhat to the Russian director Sergei Eisenstein in terms of visceral cutting, collision of images, and also sort of the popular masses, I won't say masses, but the movement of people in around turbulent events. Yes.
And you have a gut instinct too. I mean, follow your gut. I really have. What?
Your work has informed my work, so.
Your work has informed her work. Okay. Cool. Yeah, I mean, it's often true that filmmakers do look at paintings. Edward Hopper is the favorite one because he uses lighting so dramatically, and especially in urban films. And I mean, there's.
But that never works.
Yeah.
You see these painters and you say, I want this and Caravaggio, blah blah blah, and it's nice and the mood sometimes. But if it's not there, the frames go by too fast. People don't sit there appreciating Edward Hopper.
And
they don't have time. They just want to see the story. They want to see the continuity.
Right.
Unless there's a certain kind of film, and there are those films. Excuse me. They sit there like dry paint, and you watch it. That's okay.
A lot of this is also accomplished through production design. I mean, every filmmaker is building a world that will contain the characters that are moving through that world, and so production designers bring a huge, contribution, I think, to the whole discussion as well. I can take one more. Yes. Do I think there's any political filmmaking that left in American modern cinema? Is there political filmmaking in a modern American cinema?
Of course there is. What are you talking about? I mean, it's up to you. Just go out there. You have a lot of reasons to make a revolutionary film. This is a horrible time of How can the Democratic Party turn into a war party like this? How? What happened? Joe Biden has nothing to do with John Kennedy. It's a complete opposite. It's distortion. And how did this distortion happen? That's a great story. I tried to tell some of it in Untold History, and part of that is the 1990s. You got to look to the 90s to understand how the Reagan-Clinton revolution changed the deal, changed the political parties forever.
I mean, in terms of contemporary political filmmaking, I'm sure people have ideas. Raoul Peck, a Haitian-American filmmaker, very interesting filmmaker, made I Am Not Your Negro, about James Baldwin. Lumumba, also an important historical figure. I mean, in thinking for a moment, we go back to the early 60s, and we're not going to talk too much about the 60s, and we're almost finished, but there was that moment where it was JFK and Lumumba and Che Guevara and Dag Hammarskjöld, very important figure. All of these people were killed. And increasingly, the view is on Hammarskjöld that he was also basically shot down in a plane in Africa. This was a moment where things were moving in a new direction.
Yeah.
And it wasn't just the JFK assassination that happened. Even Pope John the 23rd, you know, was a force of wanting to reopen considerations and modernize. But anyway, it was a difficult time. To his credit, Oliver has tracked a lot of it. It's not the only word that's out there, but as I say, Oliver's version contributes to an understanding if we engage it. And it should also inspire younger filmmakers to also engage the realities in which we live and the characters that populate it. I mean, we need to understand our culture, we need to understand our history. Everything is not just now. So, thank you, Oliver. You're a trooper, man.
Thank you very much.
Now, we also have